Hello and welcome back. If this is your first video, ideally you have some familiarity with setting up a server and you understand what an API is and how it works. If you're not familiar, I would recommend watching the last video that I made because this video, we're just going to be jumping into a new feature that we've added to the server that we've created, which is authorization. We're going to be using JWT. We're going to be using bcrypt to hash our passwords, and we're going to be using JWT tokens to basically give people the permission that they need, which they will then use that JSON Web Token to get permission to access certain things in our server. So let's dive right in. So the first thing that I want to mention is that the way that I have this set up is that this is now a second branch on the same boilerplate that we had created. So we have our main branch, which is just our basic flat API server connected to our database. Like I said, that's what you will see in the previous video. And now we have this new branch called with-auth. And this branch has a little bit more going on. We're gonna take a look at it in just a moment. To actually get this set up, all you need to do, and I've already got this started, but we'll walk through it now, is so I cloned it. We've got with-auth test is what I chose to call this project. And then you can see we have a main branch, but we do not want to reset Git yet. We don't want to reset Git until we've switched to our with-auth branch. So we're going to do git checkout with-auth. And now that we're in the auth branch, we have all of these files, just to show you. If we were to go to main, these files would be gone. We wouldn't have the authorization, which would completely defeat the purpose if you're watching this video. So let's go back to with-auth. Okay, so now we're where we should be. We're gonna hop into the README to just copy and paste this code here. That is going to reset Git and keep it, basically make it our project. All right, and then what we also need to do is npm install. Like I said in the previous video, I really break down a lot of this, so we're not gonna waste your time jumping around with these details. If what I've done so far is confusing to you, or you're like, hey, how do I set up the API? Previous video sets up the API for you, connects it to the database, shows you how we'd seed the database, all of that. So what this video, I'm just going to show you what's different about this particular repo and how the authorization actually works. So now that we've got this, set up, what we want to do is we're still going to change our .env file. We're going to change it to a flat .env. And now we are going to change 3 of our variables in here. We're going to change our atlas URI, our test atlas URI, and we're going to add our JWT secret because we're going to need that for the creation of the JSON Web Token. And again, because this is an environmental variable, that means that it won't be accessible to anyone but, in this local setup, it's only in the .env file. And when we push this up into Heroku, we will create an environmental variable, just like we did in the previous video. We'll have one for the atlas URI, and then we'll also have one for our JWT secret. So I do already have my links created here for our atlas URI and our test atlas URI. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste those here. And then for our JWT secret, really you could put anything here if you wanted to, but you really don't want to do something that's like something like this is way too easy. My recommendation, and I'm gonna, in the description below, I'm gonna list all of these resources, is this online UUID generator, because it's just gonna, I mean, this is a lot trickier to to guess. So let's hop back in here, and we are going to put this in as our JWT secret. Nice chunky, lots of letters, words, dashes. And then we have a JWT expiry. That's going to be something that we're not necessarily going to be doing anything with that in this video, but it is nice to have, because let's say you have your front end application and you want your front end application to boot the user out when that JWT is expired. And that's going to help. You could have an idle service in your client, or you could have, you know, your JWT expiry, which is not going to let someone stay logged in for too long. So, all right, so we've got our stuff essentially set up now, right? We've got our files. Again, previous video shows you all the nitty gritty. So what's different about this repo? So there are a few things. What we did here is we do have, in our previous video, we just had the seed exercises file. We now have two more files here that are seeding into two more models into our collection in MongoDB. And the reason why I did this was because obviously, so let's start with users. So we have our users. The user model is right here. And, oh, that's the user exercise. Okay. So we've got our username, we have a full name, we have a password. This is something I just threw in here as like a little treat for you that you can use if you'd like, whether or not this person is an administrator. And that's great if you want to have like a super user that can kind of access whatever they want, as opposed to having you know, one user that can access stuff that belongs to them. You have one person that can just kind of do whatever they want inside of the app, which is super helpful if you're dealing with, I don't know, if you want to be able to just look at everything without having to hack into things. So, so yeah, so this is our user model. And we've only got 2 users in here, and the reason why is because I want the tests to show, okay, if I have user 1 going in and making a request, are they getting what they're supposed to for themselves, or are they getting stuff for this person as well, which is obviously not what we want. So we just seed in these 2 users. And then the thing I want to show here is the passwords. Now these passwords are messy, right? And of course that is intentional. If we have our passwords as they are written, just sitting in our database, that's a vulnerability that we would like to avoid, right? If someone were to somehow get into our database, we don't want them to be able to steal everybody's login information. So what we do is we used bcrypt to encrypt these passwords prior to plugging them into this seed file. And I'm going to show you really quick how we do that. So what we have to do is we're just going to open a node REPL. And all that means is we're just going to create a little bit of a, I don't know, I think a REPL is called a read eval print loop. So basically it's almost like we are, where you could run stuff through files, we're going to just run it right here in the terminal, and I'll show you why. So we just type node, and now we're in our REPL. And then what we're going to do is we know that we installed, well, actually, you don't know, but let's take a look. So we installed our new dependencies. We've got bcrypt, and we've got JSON Web Token. And those are the only 2 things that we added that are different from the last video. So let's go back into Node. So we know that we have bcrypt and JSON Web Token. They're installed. So all we need to do to actually set up bcrypt to utilize it is we're going to type const bcrypt, and then we're going to say it requires bcryptjs. Now, this should look familiar to you. This is what you see up at the top of these files. So when I press return here, we should just see undefined. That's because we're not getting anything printed out. But now we have created a variable that's bcrypt is utilizing our bcrypt dependency. So now what we're going to do let's see, right here. So as an example, I did write what this password is supposed to be so that when you see this in, you are able to access this data, but you can change this by just doing this and then updating the password right here. But we're going to keep it as password1. And all you have to do is bcrypt.hash. So basically we're calling the hash function on bcrypt. That takes in 2 arguments. The first argument is what is the actual password. So we want this to be password1. And then the next argument is a number between 1 and I believe 16. So that number is basically like the intensity of the hash. So for this example, we're just going to be using the number 1. But I'd say if you're setting this up and you're wanting to legitimately use it, definitely don't just use 1 because it's going to be the softest, simplest hash. I would recommend doing probably something between 7 and 10 at least. You can go as high as 16, but when you start to get into those much higher numbers, you're going to sacrifice speed for security, and there is a fine balance, and that's why they have the numbers 1 through 16 for us. So we're just going to put the number 1, and then we're going to add a little promise chain that just says then with that hash we are going to console log our hash. And we put this in the little object because it's going to, I mean, you'll see in just a moment, but it'll show itself as a object with the key being hash and the value being the result of this hash from bcrypt. So we should see. All right. So yeah, so you can see it's a promise. And then here is our hash, which is exactly as I said it was going to be. So you can see here, we now have this. I'm just going to copy and paste this. It does look like it's slightly different, but I'm pretty sure that makes sense because the hashes they're supposed to be confusing. That's the whole point, is so that no one can like just look at it and be like, oh, okay, I can make sense of this. There are supposed to be random symbols, numbers, capital letters, lowercase letters. And really the way that this works is that, in the best way to explain it, is that this is hashed so that we can understand it, and we can't possibly make sense of this, but bcrypt can make sense of it if we say, hey, is this password 1? Like that's really like in the simplest terms. And I one of the resources I will share is bcrypt if you want to like really dig into that. But essentially, like I said, the way that it works, we're going to hash it so that if someone finds it, they can't possibly make sense of it. But if we were to ask bcrypt, is this in here? Then bcrypt can say, yes, you got it. Ding, ding, ding. So, all right, so that is bcrypt, and that is the way that we have it set up with this one as well. The only difference is that I made this password 2. Obviously, very weak passwords, but we're not making this super legit in terms of like this obviously isn't production ready. This is more for you to play with, for you to learn, and you also have the bones to turn this into something, to turn this into a more viable product. So I also have, this one's an administrator, this one isn't. Like I said, we're not doing anything with this in this video, but I will show you the little treat that I added that you can utilize in terms of preventing someone from accessing certain things if they're not an administrator. So, all right, so we have our users file, our users seed file here. I'm going to X out all of this, keep it nice and clean for us. And now we're going to look at the user exercises. And like I said before, the reason why I had both of these files is because I could just put the users in and we would have that set up and someone could even log in and get their JSON Web Token. But how can we actually prove that that JSON Web Token holds any value unless we have something that only a specific user can access? So that's why I have this user exercises file. So the model here is the exercise. So this is the other interesting part, is we're going to be using our reference. So we're going to be able to populate in mongoose. And this is one of my favorite things about MongoDB, is that if you're familiar with SQL, you have to, it's just relational data. It is great. I get the merit of it, but when it comes to just writing the actual commands out for this, using populate in MongoDB is just, it's so much easier in comparison. You don't have to do like left joins, right joins, where this is this. It's like, you'll see in a minute what I mean. But so the way that the user exercise schema is set up is that we have our exercise key or column or whatever we would call this in Mongo, and it is referencing an exercise. So we have our exercises here, and we can say, all right, this, let's say it's the first exercise, we would reference that right here. The user ID is going to reference our user. Now this is the thing that's interesting about this, is when we plug this in, like we'll take a look and I'll show you, like these are just the object ID strings, right? But if we have the type set up like this as a reference, then we will be able to use populate. So we can either have it just be that string when we receive the data, or we can say, hey, will you fill this blank in for me? And then I just have some, basically this is just to kind of specify and make it nice and unique for us when we look at what we're getting. So frequency of the exercise, duration of the exercise. This is just like if you want to do it once a day or twice an hour or something like that. Adding a note, it's a string. I do have some defaults set here. That's just, when I made this, it was for like prescribing exercises, and I was thinking, all right, what if our provider is too busy? We just have it fill in the blanks for them if they don't have time. And then I do like to keep the date created, just because I think date paper trails are very useful for certain situations. All right, so that is our user exercise model. Now we've got only 2 exercises here, but the way that I set these up is that one exercise is for a user, our first user, and the other exercise is for our second user. Easy peasy, right? And again, in the previous video, we already know how to seed all of these. We know how to get this data into our database. So that's what's different about the seed files and the models. So we just have some extra data that goes into our database so that we can actually utilize our authorization. So the next thing that's different are our routers. So obviously, if we have exercises and we have users and we have user exercises, then just that exercises endpoint isn't going to cut it. We're going to need, well, let's just hop in and look. So I now have 3 different routers. Now this one, we will kind of touch on this, but we're not going to use this like crazy. I did throw a couple of toys in here for you guys to play with. I do think that learning by doing is awesome, and I can kind of like give you some gentle direction, but it's laid out pretty clear. I think it will be fun for you to kind of play with it a little more. So we have our authorization router, we have our user exercises router, and we have a registration router. And the registration router is to actually create a new user and put it into our database. The authorization router is how we are going to receive our JSON Web Token and log in the first place. And then our user exercises router, pretty obvious, that's going to be how we access our individual user exercises. So only thing different here is that I'm importing those, and then I've got them listed right here. So I do have basically it's set up so that the auth endpoint will take us to both of these routers, but depending on the rest of the endpoint, like if this is login, it's going to go to auth router. And I think this one might be register, like that. I suppose that could just be right there like that. You could try and play with it, see if you can work it out to do that. And then the user exercises endpoint is just example user exercises. I'm keeping this very simple, very clean, very uniform. The reason why I didn't add example stuff to this is because this stuff isn't going to change. I mean, you can add stuff if you want. You can maybe remove some stuff. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But the data, I mean, you can have whatever kind of application that you want. Logging in should still generally be the same. So let's start by looking at our auth router, shall we? Now I have a new folder here for us called middleware. And I put this here because there's a decent amount of steps that go into our authorization. And when it comes to like file structure, like application design in general, in terms of like how your files are split up, how your folders are set up, the middleware has, look at all of these. So we're just going to look at the auth router, and you'll see in just a minute why we have this split up the way that we do, because if we could have thrown this all into one file, it would have been very long, very messy. We don't want to do that. Pretty sure I mentioned that in the last video, but it's always worth reiterating that when it's split up like this, it's so much easier to maintain, it's easier to find things. You obviously don't want to go crazy. Like I'm not gonna take every single one of these little functions and put them into separate files. But if I have, I have my auth router, and my auth router calls to the auth service to do certain things, and the auth service is pretty much only involved with utilizing bcrypt, utilizing JWT, and hopping into our database, but it doesn't actually do anything with the request response, then it makes sense that I would just keep all of these together and kind of out of the way, where my auth router is actually handling our request and our response and whether or not it should pass something through to the error handler. So I'm going to try and do what I did in the previous video in terms of just verbalizing this as we go down. So when you send a request, and again, in the last video I stated, and I'm going to state again here, that if you're watching this video, you should have some understanding of like how to fetch, like what it means to send a request with a body, with headers to an API and get what you would expect back. So on the back end, you have your request and you can actually deconstruct that request based on the key value pairs inside of the body. So that's what we're doing here. We're saying, all right, we are creating a username variable and a password variable because when someone logs in, that's what they're going to send over. They're going to have a username and a password in the body, send it over to us. We have content JSON that tells us that it's JSON. It's going to parse it for us when it comes through this middleware right here. And then by the time we get it over here, it's basically just an object that we can now deconstruct, and that's what we do. So we are going to create a variable called login user that is now a object that has a key value pair of username and password. And the reason why we have this set up this way, you know, because it's almost like, okay, why did we create login user and not just use request.body if it's got username and password? That's just because there could be you don't always know what you're getting in that request. There could be a key value that's like, I don't know, just, it really could be anything. It could be like, I mean, maybe it's is admin, right? But we don't need that for someone to log in. I don't need to know whether or not someone is an admin. And then what we're doing right here is we're just iterating through this object and we're checking to see, does it have a username and does it have a password? That's all. So it's iterating through for of in our objects entries. If there isn't a value, we're just going to respond with a 400 and we're going to say we're missing one or the other in our request body. It's just this is more like helping our user out and also helping for debugging on the client. Let's say there's something missing in our fetch call. This is going to say, hey, you didn't actually put the password in your request body. And then right here, we're going to, I talked about async await in our last video. We are creating a variable called user, and we're saying, all right, I want the results of this promise to go into the auth service and call the get user with username function using our username here, right? So let's jump real quick into our auth server, our auth service, and look at the get user with username function. So you could probably guess what this does, right? It's similar to our exercises router. We are going to use that username and we are going to find that user with the username. Right here, we're just deconstructing it. Otherwise, we're going to get it in an array, and we don't need that. There's only one user. I don't want to have to type user 0 every time. Let's just deconstruct it when we're calling it in our auth service. Now, if there isn't a user, then something must be wrong. If someone typed in the wrong username or they created a user and then deleted it and now they're trying to log in and it doesn't exist, they're going to get a 400 because it's not there. Now you'll notice here I wrote invalid username or password. Now the reason why we do that is because we got to protect our stuff, right? We don't want someone, dare I say, a hacker. We don't want a hacker to be like in here typing username and it says, oh, hey, this is an invalid username. Because that now they know they're just dealing with the problem with the username and they can keep trying to work on the username, keep trying to work on the username. And then in the same way, right down here, so we'll take a peek real quick at what this does in the auth service, but to kind of tie in here, we're saying the exact same thing. And that's just because if it said, hey, you got the right username, but the password is wrong, then they know that they're halfway there, right? And we don't want that to be obvious. Someone who's logged in or who is a user would be able to figure out, oh, this isn't my username, right? So we are going into our auth service and we compare the passwords that our person sent in the request body. So you can see here, what we're doing is we went into our database and we found our user, and they have the password in the database, but it's encrypted, right? So remember how I was talking about how bcrypt will tell us whether or not that password is in that chunky mess of hash. That's what we're asking to happen here. So we're taking the password that they sent to us in the request body, and then we're taking the hashed password that's in the database for this user, and we're calling the auth service to compare those passwords. So let's look at that function here. Very easy. We've got our password, we've got our hash. We're just going to return bcrypt.compare. This is going to return true or false. It's going to say, yes, this is it. Or it's going to say, no, this isn't it. And then obviously, if it isn't, we're going to return the 400. Now, let's say everything's gone well up to this point. This person gave us the right username. They gave us the right password. This is when we're going to create their JWT. JSON Web Token. Okay, so this is a very chunky boy. So these JSON Web Tokens, basically, this is another resource I'm going to have in the video, so you can kind of really dig into it even more if you want. But there's a phenomenal website that just really helps to break it down for us, and I'm actually going to pull that up real quick so that we can look at it. But essentially what we do is we have our payload that involves, oh, and I need to remove that because that's not necessary. I'm going to write that down. We'll clean that out in the repo. Is provider in the login. Okay. So what we're doing here is we're creating our JSON Web Token by saying, okay, here are all of the credentials. This is what we've got for, so we have our subscriber, and then we have our payload, which involves some of the credentials that we were able to pull from our user in the database, because we know that the person that logged in was who they said that they were. And then we're going to create this JWT. So we're going to look in the auth service to see what that function looks like. We're taking in the subject, which we just saw as our username. And then our payload is this particular information, right? And then we're telling JSON Web Token to create a whole web token. And there's a little bit more information here. So you call it with the payload and with our JWT secret, which we plugged in as an environmental variable. This is kind of the secret sauce, right? I mean, JSON Web Token is gonna kind of in the same way, not in the exact same way, but where bcrypt is nothing without us guessing the correct password, the JSON Web Token is like the secret is really what makes it so hard to parse. But I'll show you in a minute. It's not really easy to make sense of. So we have our subject, username. We have our expires in. This is our JWT expiry, which I have set for 3 hours. You can set this for as much time. Maybe you want to do 12 hours. Maybe you just want it so that someone can't be logged in for more than a day without having to log back in. And then the algorithm. So I'm pretty sure this is just essentially, let's see, you've got a lot of different hash algorithms. I love VS Code, by the way. Look at this. It makes it so much easier to just quickly reference certain things. And actually, let's do that right here. So, because it tells you what our arguments are, right? Our payload is a string or an object, which ours is an object because it's got a lot of information in it. It isn't just one thing. Our secret, and then our signature options, which is this stuff here. So we're just going to look real quick at, let's see, this is the resource I'm going to share with y'all that really breaks down JSON Web Tokens and essentially, like, this is what it is decoded, and this is what I was just explaining. So we've got our algorithm that is how we encrypt it. There are lots of different ones. This is the standard, the HS256. And then we've got our payload, which has our subscriber, or, oh, subject, whom the token refers to. I could call it subscriber. It's fine. Name. Now, again, this is we could put whatever we want in here. This is just some helpful data that we can use when we're parsing this JSON Web Token. And then this is part of where the secret goes, right? So this is where our uuid would go. That's why I put that there. But so this is the flat data, but this is what it turns into. So this is what it looks like inside of our client, which we will see in the next video that I make, because I think after this video, we're just going to create a little client to kind of actually utilize our server and show how we're interacting with it. So that is our JSON Web Token. Let's see. And then this is how we verify it. In the same way that bcrypt will compare it if we get the right password. We get the full token, and then all we need is the secret to the secret and the algorithm to decode that JSON Web Token and ensure that this person is who they say they are, that they're coming from where we expect them to, that the token hasn't expired, whatever other information that we've decided to add. And that's the other cool part about right here. Like, I decided to add these 3 things, but that's just because of the little treat that I'm going to give y'all in terms of administrator permission. But we could do whatever we want here. We could put likes dogs, and maybe there's only a certain section for someone who likes dogs. I don't know. So this is, .put, this is if the user's JSON Web Token has expired, but they're still using the system, we can have our client call this to just get a new token. So that's our auth router. Now we are going to look, I want to look a little bit more over here at this because, well, we won't look at this quite yet. But I will show you, so this is the treat that I was mentioning, is the restricted access, and all it does, and I already removed this in the new in the boilerplate, but it's just saying if the user isn't an administrator, we're just gonna not let them through, and we'll send them a 401 and say, hey, you can't be in here. This is something that I'll show you in a minute how we actually use this middleware on particular endpoints. But this is something that you can use if you want to set up a specific like administrator endpoint that, like I said, maybe it gives you a list of all of the user exercises. Maybe you're the personal trainer and you're the one that gives the exercises to everyone, or whatever data you're using. And then this user validation service, this is really short, but it's messy, so that's why it's its own file. This is a part of the registration. So I'm going to very briefly touch on the registration router, but I don't want to go too far into that because, like I said, I want you to play with it, right? But the registration router is oh yeah, and the other thing is this router is set up so that only an administrator can register people. But you can change that, right? You could take this out. You can say, all right, anyone can register. This is open-ended, but maybe you don't want it to be that way, right? Maybe as a personal trainer, you want to be able to register your clients, and then you just say, hey, here's your credentials so you can log in and see the exercises that I gave you. So this is I don't know if this should look familiar to you. This is I'm going to remove the is provider just because I don't think that's going to be necessary for this. But this should look familiar. This is the data that we have in our database. And this is a lot of the data that we're seeing in our JSON Web Token payload. Not all of it, but some of it. And then right here is our password error, where we're validating the password for when we register. So that's where the user validation service comes in. Basically, it's just checking the password because it's good to have some password constraints. You know, you don't want someone to have like egg in all lowercase. But this is also something you can tweak, right? Let's say you want to keep it a little more lax. Maybe you don't care if it contains an uppercase, a lowercase, a number, and a special character. Maybe you only want it to contain one uppercase or something. Now, if you do that, you are going to have to change this up here, which is, I don't even know how to say this. I want to say it's regex. It's probably regex because regex is already a word. But that's what this is. So if you are going to change this, you'll have to change this. But don't worry, you could do that. There is actually, I'll go ahead and add this as a resource as well, as the regex 101. You may already be familiar with it, but it's great if you're trying to use regex to validate something. All right, so we're getting there, right? So now what we're going to do, so now that we understand, so at this point you should have a fair understanding of what it looks like when someone logs in, how we are getting their data out from the database, how we're able to find that password in the hashed password in the database, and what we're giving them, which is the JSON Web Token. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the user exercises router, and we're going to look at how this JSON Web Token actually comes into play, right? So we now have, so we're going to look here. So let's say someone makes a call to user exercises. So we're going to look at the user exercises router. Now, right here, you can see that on this particular router, we're requiring authorization, aka for someone to access this endpoint, they have to have their JSON Web Token, which means they have to be logged in and they have to have received the JSON Web Token so that they can then send it back to us. So this is where we're going to look at the JWT auth part. Okay, so like I said, they made the request. So when you make a fetch call, you should be familiar with, like, you put bearer, and then your bearer then has the token, and then you utilize that token to access the data. So this is going to show you how that actually works. So we're going to do just like we did before. We're going to walk through this verbally. So when we get this in the request, we are getting the authorization key value in our body. And this basically is just protecting us. Like, if they can't get it, we don't want this to break. So we're just going to say, if not, it's an empty string. So we're creating a variable called bearer token because we want to fill it in with, we don't want the bearer part. We don't care about that part. We just care about the actual token that happens after that. So we're saying, starting by seeing if it doesn't say bearer, they've done it wrong. The system isn't going to accept it. If you've made fetch calls, you've probably had this problem before where you made the fetch call incorrectly and it was like you're missing the bearer token. And it was either because the token wasn't there or it wasn't set up the right way. And that's what we're doing here. We're just checking for that. So if it doesn't start with bearer, we say, hey, we don't have it. And it also is, this is also gonna catch if it doesn't have our authorization in our request. Now let's say it does. So let's say we've got our authorization in our request, and then it says bearer, and then it's got our token. So if it does, then we're gonna fill this variable with the token, and then we're going to slice that string. Basically, we're just slicing this off of it. So we're slicing from here to here off of that bearer token string, and all we're going to have left is this messy part. Which doesn't make sense to us, but that's the whole point, right? We have the computers do that work for us. All right, and then you can see here we are using our auth service. So we're just verifying the JWT with this bearer token. And just to kind of pull this up again, give us a little bit of a refresher. When we're verifying the JWT, we're utilizing the JWT secret and the algorithm, and then we have that token. So we're saying, all right, JWT, here's our secret. Here's the token that we got. Can you work your magic and tell us what data is in here? Because when you're looking here, when it's decoded, you can actually get your, your username or your user ID, whatever else you need, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So we are verifying the JWT, and then with the subject, not subscriber, with the subject, which we know is the username, right? Because that's how we have it set up when we create this JSON Web Token in our auth router. We're going to go into the database and we're going to get our user with the username, which is right here, because we've called this function before, right? So if there isn't a user, so let's say we get a wonky JSON Web Token and this user doesn't exist, hey, we'll say, hey, you can't get in here, right? Otherwise, we're attaching all of that user data to the request body. So basically what we're doing is we're using that JSON Web Token to work our JWT magic, using that bearer token that they gave us in the JWT secret. And once we decode that JWT, we have our username. And then we use that username to get the user out of the database. And now we have all of this user data. We have whether or not they're an administrator, we have their username, we have their full name, we have their user ID, and then we're just going to attach it to the request body. Well, technically, okay, well, double back here. Technically, we're not attaching it to the request body. We're attaching it to the request itself. Because when you see in the auth router, we have request.body, which is the body key in our request object. And then user is now a key in our request object. Wanted to correct myself there to make sure we're keeping it accurate. So now we can just now we can just press on, right? We're just going to move forward. We're calling next. So all we're doing here is we're saying, all right, this user is valid. I am now going to take all this user data, put it in, add it on to my request object, and now we're just going to keep going down the line. And that's why when you're looking at this, it starts with this, right? We're using requireAuth, but then we continue on to this. But what's new, what's happened now, is that we now have all of our user data on this request without the client side putting all of that vulnerable data in their request body. We don't want that to happen because that's just, it's the ether space. You can't trust it. So we're just checking to make sure that this person is actually logged in and they actually have an account, right? Then when this person makes their request, they're going to have the user ID as a parameter. And I will show you in our test what that looks like. Okay, so we did a little bit of debugging. I like to leave these in the video because from what I gather, you as a dev, you debug for the rest of your life. So what happened was when I saw it said request.params, I was like, that doesn't seem right, because when it's params, it's this. Something like that, right? It would be, if I did ID equals request.params, then it would pull whatever they had put in here. But we're not going to do that. Why would we, right? We don't need them to make a request to an endpoint that has the user ID. We just got the user ID because the authorization that I just walked you through gets the user information. So I cleaned this up a little bit. I did a little bit of debugging with the tests, and now I'm going to show you what we're doing. So we're taking the ID variable off of the user that we got through here, and we're going to use that to, and this is where the populate magic happens, and I love this. So what we're doing is, like I said, we've got the ID of our user now, which we pulled from the user object that we added to our request object that had the ID. So we took that, and then we said, all right, we're going to create a user exercises variable, and we're going to wait for the results of going into our user exercise model in our MongoDB. We're going to find the exercises where the user ID is equal to this ID variable. So basically, whoever's making this request, we're going to find their particular exercises. And then we're going to populate all of the exercise data right in there. So when I say that, that kind of ties back into, or it definitely ties back into this here, where we are saying that we're referencing the exercise based on this exercise variable in our user exercise schema. And then when we look at our exercise model, where is it? So basically, when we make this call, we're going to get everything that we saw in the user exercise, but where the exercise key is, we're going to get the exercise name and the date that that exercise was created. And again, this sky's the limit, right? I can add a ton of data right in here, and when I ask MongoDB to populate, like I could even have it populate the user, and then when someone requests the user exercise, they get all of the user data, they get all of the exercise data, and then they also get all of that particular user exercise data. It's absolutely amazing. And then again, we're doing lean. That just turns it into a simple object. Otherwise, you get this weird, and I think this is something more advanced dev would know. but I'm sure there's a lot more going on with it, but we just want the data. We're not trying to do anything crazy today. So if there aren't any user exercises, if this breaks somehow, we say that the exercises weren't found. And then otherwise, we're returning this as an object that says user exercises. So that's it. We're keeping this simple. I don't want to go crazy. These videos can be very long if I were to try to go too insanely in depth, but that in itself is the gist of how all of this is working. So we're using that auth router for someone to log in and get the credentials. And then they're able to use those credentials to actually get into this endpoint and get their respective exercises. So what we're going to do now is, of course, we have tests, right? That was actually what I used to debug. I do have a couple of not passing tests, but they are just related to the fact that I removed is provider. So I'm going to clean that up really fast before we jump into the tests. But we're going to look at the tests that I wrote to validate that all of this is actually working the way that we would expect it to. All right, so I cleaned that up, and now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the new tests that we added. So the first set of tests, I'm just going to clean all this up for us. All right, so going into our test folder, you can see we now have some new tests. I did clean this up a little more. Like I put the app test on its own file. We have our exercises endpoint. Again, this is so simple. I would recommend playing with the tests as well. Like maybe create a test for, let's say it, well, we'll use a better example in a minute, but this is the test that we created in the last video where we're just making a flat request. There's no authorization required. We just get a couple of exercises. But in here, in the user exercises, we still only have one test. This is where I'm going to suggest playing with the tests, maybe create some more and see if we can create tests for the not ideal situations. So like this is just saying, all right, I'm expecting a 200 and all of the particular user exercises for that logged in user. Maybe we say returns 401 if no one is logged in. And then you write a test for someone that doesn't have an authorization, who doesn't have the header set up. So let's run these tests. Oh, I have no idea what I just did there. Okay. And we're going to look and we're going to see that all of these tests are passing, which is obvious because I already ran them to double check because I cleaned them up. But what I want to look at here is we're going to just look at the user exercises test because it's just one, and then I will kind of show you the auth endpoints because it does what I just explained. It also is like, hey, you can't get in. Hey, you're not allowed. So obviously we're putting things into our database. We have our test database. We have our dummy data. So this is the other thing, is we have way more content going in. We don't just have our exercises array. We also have a users array. We have a user exercises array. We have a function to make the fixtures. So this is going to make all three if we want, and then return an object instead of us having to call all three every time. We have a function that does that for us. And we export all of that. And then we have action figures, action figures, that is going to do some of the JWT stuff that we would need. So if I'm gonna, so as an example, in our user exercise test, we want to pretend that this user is logged in, but that means they need a bearer token, which means they need a JWT signed token. So that's what's happening here. That's what this function is doing. You feel free to jump in and explore this, but basically it's doing what I just said it does. It's doing bearer space, has the token, which is JWT signed, using our payload, our secret, and our additional details, including the JWT expiry and all that. I also have some functions in here to like make a new exercise, to make a new user exercise, to make a new user, and these are good for when you're writing tests to insert into our database, which is why we have these set up in here. Okay, so this one test, right? We are expecting that if someone makes a request, they get the exercises for themselves. So we're making a GET request to this particular endpoint. We are setting our authorization to our bearer token. So we're calling the make-auth header, which I just showed you that function. And then we're going to be using our test user, the second one in our array. So you can see here's our test users. And that is a part of the content fixtures that we've got. So it's basically going to be this person right here. Or no, sorry, this is our user exercises. It's going to be this person right here. Oh yeah, the other thing I want to show you, and you might be wondering this, is why are these passwords not hashed? Excellent question. So the reason why is because we actually have them getting hashed as they're being put into the database. And the reason why is because we want to use these passwords in our auth tests without having to like write them out. If we can just access our array information and just access the object, then all we have to do, and that's exactly why this is set up the way that it is, right? My exercise is exercises 0 ID, because if I change this ID, I don't want to have to also go down and change this ID. That's going to be way more work than I need. So we're just gonna call it. We'll just access it that way. Okay, so yeah, so on the way into the database, our users will be getting their passwords hashed. And again, we're just using a hash of 1. That could be made more complicated, and I would definitely recommend it for a production product. So we're seeding our test tables prior to calling this. We're creating our users array. We are calling a GET request to this endpoint. We're setting our authorization with our authorization header using the second user in our array. And then we're expecting a 200. And then with that response, we're going to go into the user exercises object, or well, it's an array. So the body is an object with the user exercises key, which is an array of exercises. So we are going to iterate through that array, and for each exercise, we're expecting the user ID to equal the ID of the person making the request. AKA, if I get an ID for another person, I know that this is not working. I'm also expecting, this is what we know is going to be in our user exercise based on the schema that we have set up, right? So we're expecting frequency and duration to be in there. But then what I'm also doing is I'm checking the populate. So if I go into exercise, am I going to get just an ID, or am I going to get an object with the property of exercise name, because populate is working for us? So what I want to do here is, just to give us a good visual, I'm going to console log our response.body.user exercises so that we can actually see what we're looking at here, right? Because we know that we're expecting to see an array of exercises. We should only have one exercise. The ID should match the test user ID. If not, this test will fail. We're expecting it to have a frequency, a duration, and then we're also expecting, I think it will depend, like maybe I need to do, just to be, because I think if we don't actually iterate into it, it's going to, it's going to just say object, and I don't want to do that. So to clarify what I'm doing here, I'm going into that user exercises array, I'm picking the first item, and I'm checking the exercise variable to see if it's been populated or if it's just a string. All right, moment of truth. Okay. So you can see there's a lot of tests here, and I'll show you in just a second. Let's see. So we'll just look at them for a second. So it's saying responds with 400 required error when the password is missing. Responds with 400 invalid username or password when it's a bad password. Responds 200 and JWT using secret when the credentials are valid. So a lot of these tests are a part of the auth endpoints test, which I will very briefly look at, but I would recommend exploring that on your own. But mainly it's doing, just like I said, we're not just testing for the successful outcome for the 200, we're also testing for the 400. And then for this, a little challenge for you is when you are working on this user exercises or whatever endpoint that you're making that does require authorization, set up a test that says that you're expecting a 401 when the credentials are wrong or when there isn't an authorization header. So I did set this up here with the console log, so let's look at that. So we can see here that we have an array, right? So this is response body user exercises, right? So it's an array with one object in it, so a single exercise. Let's see. So this is the object, right? But we can see right here where exercise would normally just be a string, right? If we're looking at the database content, oh, it's already right there. So when we're looking at the database content and we're looking at the user exercises, we can see that the exercise is actually just an ID. But because MongoDB is just wonderful and we called populate on exercise, it went to the exercise model, found the matching ID, and filled in all of this for us. Which again, I feel like that's so much easier than doing the joins and stuff in SQL. But we've got it right here. We've got the name of the exercise. We've got the ID of the exercise, the date created. And then I did try to access it on its own, which I'm seeing right here, but we actually didn't need to do that after all. So very last thing is we're going to look at the authorization endpoint tests. There are a decent amount. So we obviously start by seeding our tables with our dummy data. We're creating our test users here, and then you can see we're just, again, this makes it so much easier for us, right? If I decide I want to change the username of the first test user, I do not have to change it in a lot of spots. I only have to change it where it's officially being created. That is ideal situation. That's maintainable, cleaner code. So it responds with the required area when a certain field is missing. So we created an array with the required fields, and then we iterate through those and call this test on each of these. So basically, if this is missing, you get a 400. If this is missing, you get a 400. We do the exact same thing here. Basically, we're calling both of these tests for each of them. So we're expecting a 400, but we're also expecting this particular response, which I explained why we do that. This is the expected token. So we called JWT and signed using all of this information and this information, which I've already explained. And then we compare. So we're expecting the authorization token that we get as a response to be this token that we just created here, which we know is testing, or we know is passing. And then this is me testing the register endpoints. So we're expecting that it's going to validate whether or not we're missing any of these fields because they're all required. This is, we're basically testing to make sure that you can't create a, you can't have two people with the same username, obviously. This is just all the password validation stuff. So password must be, password must be, password must not. This is the successful. So yeah, so this is the best way to set up the tests, right? You start with all the like situations where it wouldn't work out because we expect it to not work out, and that the person does get the information, like the user gets the information that they would need to get to remedy that issue. And then at the end here, we have the best case scenario. They did exactly what they needed to, and they get exactly what they were expecting. So that's it. I think this is a great time to wrap up this video. We're pushing a little over an hour. Hopefully you learned a lot about authorization here. Like I said in the next video, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna create a very simple little boilerplate to play with this particular server and API. So if you watched the first video, you should know how to deploy this and how to set this up. The only real difference here is that you need to plug in all of these environmental variables. So if you have the authorization set up, you need this JWT secret set up and the expiry set up in our Heroku environmental variables. And the previous video is gonna be in the README, and it also has timestamps. So if you're like, I don't want to hear all of this explanation, I just want to know how to do this particular part, that is actually logged out for you now, thanks to a suggestion that someone made on the previous video. Thank you for that. Feedback is great. It always helps you to level up a little bit, right? So, I guess same thing, right? If you have any feedback on this, if there's something that really didn't click for you, that didn't quite make sense, or if you're having trouble with this boilerplate somehow and it's not working, definitely leave a comment and let me know so that I can make an adjustment. I have tested this on my own, so I think it should be working, but hopefully this really kind of made it even more like, oh, okay, that's how authorization works. And then I think in the next video, it'll be really cool to see, because I remember when I did this, it made sense, right? Like I was like, okay, I see how this works, but it didn't quite click. Like, how does this work on the client side? Like, how does this work for someone who logs in to an application? And that's where the next video will come into play, because we're going to see how the JWT token is stored and how we use it to send off our requests. So yeah, thanks for watching. So there is one thing I actually want to add to this video, because I think this is really interesting. Web3, right? It's all the rage right now. I think that the way I feel about Web3 and like cryptocurrency and decentralization in general, I think that we're really on the precipice of something big, right? We're currently nurturing seeds for something that could be huge. So I just wanted to mention this because I found this article and I thought that it was super interesting because I just showed you all this JWT stuff, right? And it's so intricate and complicated. It's hard to kind of beat the system, right? Like you can't, it's intentionally complicated so that someone can't impersonate someone else. You've got your secret environmental variables and everything. But Web3 is it's so cool. Like this article in particular is talking about how, and if you're not familiar with this stuff yet, like basically the way that it works is that you have your like wallets attached to your browsers, and you can use that wallet to log into things. It's almost like OAuth, I feel like, but I think it's different in that the OAuth is just connected to another centralized application, whereas your wallet is yours. So I thought that this article was so interesting because it's like, hey, you don't need JWT anymore. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that this is not going to happen overnight, right? It may happen kind of quickly. Like we may see this in the next like 4 or 5 years, which I know doesn't sound like a lot. Like it maybe sounds a little longer, but this is no time at all. So it's probably good to still have an awareness of JWT and how to use it, but eventually, like this is what I think is so cool. So this is like a visual of JWT, right? So you generate your signature, we verify that signature, and this is actually using Web3 with JWT, but this is a good visual of how we utilize JWT, right? They send us the token, we use that token they send us the login, we use that login to find the user, we create a token, we send the token back to them, and then they use the token to make requests to us, and then we use that token to access their information. So it's really very similar to this visual, like doop, 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 doop. But so with the Web3, in lieu of all of that, the user just sends their signature. We get their address, and they're authenticated. So easy, so clean. I think it's fascinating. Now, it does say here the user generates a signature. It has an expire date, but if an attacker gets the signature, it won't be useful for long, but it would be useful. So anyway, I thought this was interesting. I just wanted to add this to the end of the video because I think that it's just so fascinating to me that I do think we're at the beginning of just simplifying this type of stuff, because in lieu of doing all this roundabout stuff to protect it, it's like the person can just be like, hey, here's my wallet that you can actually look at. Yeah, so